All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint slides for Murox, ASP.NET 4.6 Web Programming with C# 2015 6th edition. And I've done the first three chapters, so I'm going to start on Chapter 4 right now, as you can see, how to develop a multi-page web application. In this example, I've brought up the author's example, all right, and hopefully I can just run it. So again, this is the author's, not mine. So this is that Halloween Superstore with 2 pages. So notice, please select a product. So if I click here and I'll choose Hippie, and you can see how that changed it. This all changed over here, price changed, etc. So I can buy one of those if I want, add it to my cart. And now it's showing me what's in my cart. I don't want it anymore. I got to choose an item to remove it, or I can just empty my cart if I go back to check to continue shopping. So let's just add a few things here. So we'll add an Austin Power. Continue shopping. I'm going to put about 5 things in here. Fog machine. Jar. Let's get 3 of those. So you can see what's in there. Now I can highlight any one product, click remove, and get it out of there. All right, and if I'm done, if I'm not done, I can go back to continue shopping. Otherwise, I can go to checkout. Now, I don't believe the checkout has been implemented in here. That's what it says. Okay? So just so you see all of that information. Again, was that important? Yes, it actually was, because what I wanted you to do in there was I wanted you to see what the finished application looks like. And that's what the author has you build throughout the chapter, or at least talks about throughout the chapter. So, Chapter 4 again starts on page 125, how to develop a multi-page web application. Here are our objectives. Given the specs for a multi-web page app that uses an SQL data source, SQL, an acronym for structured query language. What this says is that information I showed you before in that drop-down list. So when we chose Austin Powers and Jar and Fog Machine, etc., all that information and all of the corresponding information, which had the image, the descriptions, etc., all that stuff was from a database. All right? We want to be able to use the transfer, redirect, or cross-page posting. In other words, we want to be able to transfer information from one web page to another web page. All right? Use absolute or relative URLs. What's the difference? In a nutshell, the big difference is if a URL starts with HTTP or HTTPS or FTP, it's an absolute URL. Typically, if it doesn't, it's a relative URL. So again, what I just told you is a generalization, but it's a generalization that will at least typically be true. Number 4, use session state to store, update, and retrieve application data. So we want to be able to create a user session. So as we iterate our way from page to page, the information is going to come with us for the ride, so to speak. We want to set a starting page for an application before we test it. Those are our applied objectives. As far as our knowledge objectives, describe the content, so what goes into the app data folder, the content folder, and the model folder, those 3 folders in an ASP.NET application. So we'll look at that. Describe 2 ways that you can use an existing class with a new web application. Distinguish between the transfer method, redirect, and redirect permanent methods, as opposed to cross-page posting. Distinguish between absolute and relative URLs, and along with that, describe the use of the tilde, which is shown right here in a URL. Describe what an SQL data source is. In general terms, explain how an SQL data source, data view, and data row classes can be used to get data from a data source. Describe how a session objects, IDs, and cookies are used to track the users of a web application. So again, this is a two-page application. It has both an order page where you can order items and change the item by clicking that down arrow, and a shopping cart page, which shows the results, and it shows what you currently have purchased, and it gives you the opportunity to remove items, remove all items, go back and continue shopping, or check out. So here, as it says, this is the Solution Explorer. So you'll notice there's a lot of stuff in there. All right? So we're going to have a cart.aspx file and an order.aspx file. The order ASPX file is this one. The cart ASPX file is this one. All right? These cart item.cs, cart item list.cs, and product.cs. Those are our models. They are classes. They have no GUI component. They will apply the business logic to the program. It is imperative that you read this chapter. I don't know about you. I'm definitely not good enough that I can understand the material in the chapter without reading it first. So here's the folders that we're going to have. App data. And by default, app data contains database files. Content, which will have our Bootstrap NuGet package CSS files in it. Fonts, which will have the glyphicons that were added from the Bootstrap NuGet package. Images, which we create and put in our own image files. Models, as it says, they're the class files. They will incorporate the business logic, and scripts, which are our JavaScript files. All right, give me a second here. All right. So here's the actual files in the shopping cart application. The app data will hold our database. I'm not positive, but I think MDF stands for Microsoft Database Format. All right, so this will hold the Halloween database. Content will have multiple files in it. As it says, there'll be the CSS files used to style the web page. All right. Images will hold our banner image. That is this right here. Models, again, will be our non-GUI class files, which will incorporate our business logic. And scripts will hold our JavaScript files. Okay, so I already mentioned these. Models are going to have these three files. Notice cart item will represent an item in a shopping cart. Item list will be all of the items together in our shopping list. And product will represent the different products that we have. And you'll notice that both cart and order have three files associated with them. The ASPX, which is our ASPX file. You can look at that in some ways, at least, as like being our interface. The ASPX.cs file, all right, and that's the code behind, so that's where we can add, if as needed, any logic. And each one also has a designer.cs file. Normally, by default, by convention, anything that's got as.aspx.designer.cs, you probably won't want to jack with. You want to make sure that you're not hurting, because that's a system-created file. Notice that there's also a global.asax file, not ASPX, ASAX file, used to work with application objects and your configuration files, which end with .config. All right. Now, the first thing is, just so you see this, when we bring up our project here, we've got cart ASPX, and we've got order ASPX. All right? When we run the program, it should at least immediately bring up our order page. That's the way it's set up right now. Okay? But what if we didn't want that? What if we wanted it to start, rather than with the order page, we wanted it to show us the cart when we first started? Then we can do two things. We can right mouse click on cart.aspx, and we can choose view in browser, all right, which will run that page right away, or we can create their select the start page. So I changed the start page, so now notice when I run the project, what should come up, rather than our order page, what should come up is our cart page. I know it's taking its own sweet time, but you see now it's starting with a cart. Now that's not what we want, but I just want to show you how you can change it. So I'm going to right mouse click on the order page and again choose set as start page. Okay. So I think I've kind of gone over that already, the menu for changing your all right. So this is 130 and 131 in the book. If I decide that I want to change the name of something, I'm not going to do it, but I'm going to show you how to do it. So let's say I didn't want to call this order, I wanted to call it orders. Typically it is singular here, but I could right mouse click on here and I could choose rename. And notice it turns blue and I can change it to anything I want to change it to. If instead of that, if I right mouse click and I choose delete, notice I will be given a dialog which says basically it'll delete it permanently, and there is no way to automatically retrieve it again. So I'm going to cancel that. I'm just trying to show you some of the stuff that's in here. So I showed you how to set the start page, how to rename a file. We can how to rename a form, and how to delete a file. So again, by default, what ASP.NET does is it displays the page named default.aspx. Now, if you've renamed that, or you have a different page in there, you can set that as your start page by using what I just showed you. And I showed you the rename command also. Now, had I come in here and right mouse clicked and chosen rename and changed that to carts, for example, had I done that, then this file in here, these two files would have also automatically been changed to carts. If I want to come in here and if I want to add a new class, now you notice I've got these three already, but let's suppose I didn't have them. I could right mouse click on my models, I could choose add new item, and when I iterate my way through here, I'll find somewhere in here, it'll be a class file. All right, so HTML page, boom, boom, boom. I know that it's in here. This is web. Under code, there's class. So that's one way I can do it. I believe I can also right mouse click on here, choose add, and class right there. Okay, so there's different ways that I can do this. Again, this is explained on pages 132 and 133 in your textbook. All right, let's talk next, based on 134 and 135, how we can go and redirect or transfer to another page. So I just showed you how to change the start page, how to rename a file, how to rename a form, how to delete a file. So you've seen all this now. Showed you the dialog for adding a new class to the models folder, and that brings us to here. Now the transfer method of the HTTP server utility class terminates the execution of the current page, and it transfers control to the specified URL. If you use this, you use the server property of the page. The redirect URL redirects the client to the specified URL and then terminates the execution of the current page. The redirect URL permanently redirects the specified URL and terminates the execution of the specified page, especially with the redirect permanent. Let's suppose that I'm going to create my own website, that I'm going to start offering loans to people, and I not too vain, but I call it Jeff's Loans, and I buy the domain jeffsloans.com. I might also decide that while I'm buying jeffloans.com, I also buy jeffloans.net, jeffloans.gov, jeffloans.edu, and etc. And if somebody opens them up, so puts the jeffloans.edu, for example, I can permanently redirect them to the index or whatever page or default ASPX page on jeffsloans.com. Okay? When you use this the redirect method, you've never seen that before. I was producing the previous document that I created, so there we go. All right. So with the redirect, the server sends a special message called an HTTP redirect message. Then the browser sends an HTTP request to the server requesting that new page. This requires what's called an extra round trip, which means you're making another trip back to the server. But the URL will then be shown in the address bar that's up on the top of the screen. So again, if you change a name or a location, or you permanently want to make somebody go, when they start on one page, go to another page, you can use the redirect permanent method. Okay? All right. 136 and 137. So here's some examples. There's a transfer, there's a redirect, there's a redirect permanent. Okay. On 136 and 137, they talk about a fourth way to transfer to a different web page, and that is by using cross-page posting. In this case, you specify the URL of another page in the postback URL property of a button. Then when the user clicks the button, an HTTP post message that contains the URL specified is sent back to the server. As a result of this, the page with the URL is loaded and executed rather than the page that was originally displayed. If you use custom properties with this, I don't know if that's even shown here, but if you use custom properties, you must set the previous page type directive right below the page directive at the top of the ASPX file. All right, we don't have to worry about that for now. The absolute and relative URLs, I've already shown you. Again, they're absolute because they start with either HTTP, HTTPS, or FTP normally. For a relative URL, it's where you are relative to one of these. So when you code an absolute URL, you code the complete URL, including the domain name. When you code a relative URL, you base it on the current directory. To go to the root directory for the host, you code a slash. To go up a level, you have 2 periods followed by a slash. So going up 2 levels would be 2 periods, a slash, 2 periods, and a slash, etc. If you specify a URL for the property of a server control, you can use the web application root operator to base the URL on the root of the web app. So all that's fine and dandy, but now it's time to go in and actually start talking about databases. Now with databases, just so you see this, let's go over to here. Couple things. First, let me bring this up. All right, we've already talked about a lot of these standard tools, not all of them, but many of them already. Notice there's one here that says data. And it has different things. The ones that we're going to be the most concerned with for this class will be details view, empty data source, form view, grid view, list view, sitemap data resource, XML, SQL data resource, and XML data resource. All right. Before you can create a data resource or a data source for a file, you must add the database file to the app data folder. So you'll notice in here, there is our Halloween.mdf. So it needs something. These controls that are here under the data tab, by and large, need an associated database to act with. Now this database that is shown right here with a .mdf, that is an SQL Server database. SQL Server is a Microsoft product, but Microsoft claims that their product will work with SQL Server, that it will work with Microsoft Access, that it will work with Oracle, that it'll work with MySQL. Okay? These are all things that you can go and check out on your own if you have the desire. So if you want to go in and you want to create a new data source, you open up the data group, which is what I've already done. And if I wanted to put in a new data source here, okay, I literally could just go in and find SQL data source and literally just take it and drag it right onto my screen. And it puts one in. Now, when I go and jump back here to designer mode, there it is, the SQL data source. So when you do this, you can go and you can click up here. That's called a smart tag with a little arrow in it. And then I can tell it to configure the data source. When I do that, by and large, if it's brand new, I'm going to have to click New Connection. And then I'll have to tell it what type of a file I'm working with here. So again, if it's the first time you're connecting to a database file, it might ask whether or not you want to save the connection. So if that happens, click yes. So I can come in here and let's say I want to choose Microsoft Server database file. So SQL Server database file. So I click there, I click continue. Now the stuff that's up here, this is access. This is ODBC, which stands for Open Database Connectivity. That will work basically with anything, including the stuff that's already here. But ODBC, for example, if you have your data in a spreadsheet and you want to link to it in a database, you can use ODBC for it as an example. This is Microsoft SQL Server. So as it says, you use this to connect to Microsoft SQL Server 2005 or above. And this is server, this is server database file. If you're using SQL Express, and I believe that's the one we're going to use. This is Oracle, and this just says other, and I've never used other. Just so you have a little bit of an idea of what's going on there. So if I click here, and I click continue, now it'll say, what database do you want to use? So I can click browse. By default, it'll come through here, and this isn't the one I'm using. I'm going to my C drive, Muroc, ASP.NET 4.6, student downloads, book apps, Chapter 04 cart. And when I look in here, Chapter 04 cart, app data, there it is. So if I click that and click open, all right, that's going to fill the stuff in there for me. Then I'm asked, do I want to use my regular Windows authentication, which means that once I'm logged in to Windows, I'm also logged into the database. Or I can use SQL Server, which provides an additional layer of validation. So in that case, the user, before they can use the database, must log in with their username and password. All right. I can test here to make sure my connection works, and it says that it succeeded, and I click OK. Under this connection string, this shows what the system built for me. It's telling me with that local DB that I'm basically using, I believe that says I'm using SQL Server Express. Here's the name of our database. We want the internal security or integrated security set to true. And if we cannot connect within 30 seconds, we want it to time out. So those are all things that we got by default. So I click next again, and it says, what do you want to call this string? Notice by default, it gives it a very generic or a very vanilla name of connection string. If I created another one, I believe it calls it connection string 2, etc. So I'll just keep the default one and I'll click next. And now it says, okay, what you have in here is you've got these tables. Categories, customers, etc. So if I click categories, it says these are what you have. If I want to click show everything, I can highlight that. And if I only want to show the category ID and the short name, I can do it like that. And it's showing you the SQL statement that it's building down below. Then I can click next. And it says if I want, I can test my query to make sure it works. And it's showing me these are my categories and these are my names. You'll notice that in this case, although it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, in this case, the category ID and the short name are the same. Let's back up out of this and let's change this. So let's change it from categories. Oh, what do we want? Let's change it to products because there's a lot more stuff here. Okay? So let's say I want I don't care about the product ID. I want the name and the long description and the category ID. All right, and I click here and I tell it to test the query. This should change now because I'm working off a different table so you can see what I have. There's my name, there's my long description, there's my category ID. So I can build anything I want to build in here. All right. All right, so I showed you on 140 and 141 how to create the SQL data source. On 142 and 143, I showed you how to configure it. And if we bring this up again, I click configure one more time, go to next. We showed you all that. Once you've created a data source, you can bind to it to a drop-down list as shown in your book on figure 410. So in other words, this. When you do this and you start to select the options that are in here, it's going to, it's fairly intuitive. All right, when it tells you to choose a data source, most of the time I think you're going to be able to figure out what you want to do and how to do it. Okay? And it'll write ASPX code for you. So it says you're using this drop-down list. It's a server-side control. It should automatically be posted back, so every time you change the value that's in your drop-down list, you want it to go back to the server. Here's its name. This is the name, the text field, so that's the name that it's going to show there. The value is what it's going to be basing it on. So it'll show you the name, but it'll be basing what you check on the product ID. These properties for binding a drop-down list are shown on 144 and 145 in your book. The data source ID is the ID of the data source, of course. The data text field is the name of the data source field that should be displayed inside of the drop-down list itself. So it's the name that you're going to see in here. The data value field is the name of the data source field that should be accessed. So it's the database field that you're looking to get the information from. You can bind a drop-down list to a data source so the list automatically displays the data retrieved by the data source. You can use the data source connection wizard dialog box to configure the data binding accordingly. Alternatively, you can use the properties window to do some of this. Now, the nice thing about doing this is when you do it, you don't have to typically write a lot of code. Depending on how you do it, you might have to write no code whatsoever, a little bit of code, or if you're constantly customizing and tweaking, maybe even a lot of code. This select method that you see right there of the data source returns what's called an I enumerable. The I stands for interface. The enumerable stands for for lack of better words, kind of a user collection object that contains the rows retrieved from the database. To work with these rows, you must cast the I enumerable to a data view object, and that's what we're doing right there. The row filter, all right, lets you filter rows in the data view based on some criteria. You can also use what are called indexers of the data view class to return a specific row as a data row view object. These classes are stored in the system.data namespace. Now, going back to our code, what the author is talking about, let's just keep it real simple. What the author is talking about, is trying to make sure that the connection works. So as I run this, and it comes up with my order page as I change the information. So if I change this to uglier rat, I want to make sure the picture changes, the short description changes, the long description changes, and the price changes. That's what we're doing right here. Now, when we want information to be able to be used on multiple pages, which is one of the things that we're interested in here, then we have to be concerned with something that is referred to as session state. I mentioned this back in Chapter 1. I'm saying it again right now. The hypertext transfer protocol is known as a stateless protocol. So it does not do a good job as a user is moving back and forth between maybe somebody's cart page and other pages. So this picture, I believe this was shown in Chapter 1. The client makes an HTTP request to the server. The server attempts to answer that. If it can, it returns the requested page along with session ID information. So when the browser requests another page, the server can use the section ID included in the request to associate the browser with the correct session object. So you're talking about building a session. Why might you do that? Number one, if you wanted to keep information about a user, such as the user's name, etc. Number two, if you wanted to save the objects the user is working with, and or number 3 if you want to keep track of pending operations. So here are some of the common session state properties. So session state is used to track the state of each user in an application. It includes a session ID that's sent back to the browser as what's referred to as a cookie, which is a non-executable text file. Then the browser automatically returns the session ID cookie to the server. If you want your app to work on browsers that don't support cookies, you can configure ASP.NET to encode the session ID in the URL of the page. More about that in Chapter 8. You can use the session state object to store and retrieve items across executions of an application. As far as working with this, these common members, this is 150 and 151 in the book. First, we've got the session ID, which is the unique ID of the session. Then we've got the count, which is the number of items in the session state collection. The name, which is the value of the session state item with a specified name. Add, which allows us to add things to a cart. Clear, which removes all things from a cart. And remove name, which removes a specified item from a cart. The session state object is created from the HTTP session state class. That defines a collection of session state items. To access a session state object from a code behind file, you use the session property of the page. To access the session state object from a class other than the code behind, you use the current property of the HTTP context class. By default, session state objects are maintained in server memory, so you should avoid using them if they're very large because they can slow down an application. Here are some operations that you can use. Now, for the rest, pretty much the rest of the chapter here, the next 15 to 20 pages, talk about the business classes of the cart application. And after those business classes, it shows them to you in detail. Then it shows the web forms. So it talks about the cart.aspx page and the order.aspx page in detail. So I'm going to break right here, and I'll pick it up a little bit later.